Mountain Widow agreed to marry a stranger. The first thing he did was dig a grave. Martha pressed her palm against the cold wooden door frame and watched the stranger dig his hole in her yard. The shovel bit into the frozen ground with sounds like breaking bones. Each strike sent small clouds of his breath into the gray morning air. She had been standing there for near an hour now, and still he had not looked up at her. Still he had not spoken his name. The snow had started falling again during the night. Fat, heavy flakes that stuck to everything and made the world look clean and quiet. But there was nothing clean about what she was watching. Nothing quiet about the way her heart hammered against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to remember the words from his letters. The careful handwriting on thin paper that had come to her through the trading post. Words about needing a wife and a home. Words about being a good man who could work hard and provide. But he had never written about graves. Never mentioned the small wooden box that sat beside his wagon, covered with a canvas tarp that flapped in the wind like something trying to escape. Behind her, she could hear her children moving quiet as mice in the cabin. 8-year-old Thomas pressed against the window, his breath making small circles of fog on the glass. 5-year-old Mary sat by the fire, holding her corn husk doll tight against her chest. They had not spoken since the man arrived at dawn. They had just watched with wide eyes as he unloaded his shovel and picked this spot beneath the old pine tree where the ground was softest. Martha had wanted to ask him to stop, had wanted to run out and grab the shovel from his hands and tell him to take his sorrows and his secrets and keep moving down the mountain. But something in the set of his shoulders stopped her. Something in the careful way he measured the hole with his eyes and hands. Like he had done this before. Like he knew exactly how deep grief needed to be buried. The wind picked up and carried the smell of snow and pine needles. It also carried something else. The scent of a man who had been traveling too long. Dust and sweat and the kind of tiredness that settles into your bones when you have been carrying weight that was never meant to be carried alone. She thought about her husband James, buried 2 years now in the small cemetery down by the creek. How the preacher had said words over him while she stood there with dirt on her dress and Thomas holding tight to her hand. How the hole had looked so final, so hungry. She had stood at the edge and felt like she might fall in and never climb out. But this was different. This man was digging with purpose, not grief. His movements were steady and sure, like he was planting something instead of burying it. Like maybe this hole was the first step toward something instead of the last step away from something. Thomas made a small sound behind her, and she turned to see him pointing at the window. The stranger had stopped digging. He stood waist-deep in the hole now, leaning on his shovel handle and looking up at the sky. Snowflakes landed on his dark hair and melted there. His face was weathered like old leather, lined with years of sun and wind and things she could not name. For a moment, their eyes met across the yard. His were the color of deep water, and they held something that made her stomach turn over. Not danger exactly, but something close to it. Something that asked questions she was not sure she wanted to answer. She lifted her hand in a small wave. He nodded once and went back to his digging. The letters had started coming in the fall, when the nights grew long and the wood pile seemed to shrink no matter how much Thomas helped her stack. She had not asked for them, had not even known such things were possible. But the trading post keeper had brought them to her with a gentle smile and said that sometimes the mountain got lonely, and lonely people found ways to reach each other. The first letter had been careful and polite, full of facts about his age and his work and his need for a woman to help him start fresh in a new place. She had folded it up and put it in the drawer with the dish towels. But that night, after the children were asleep, she had taken it out and read it again by candlelight. The second letter had been longer. It told her about the farm he wanted to buy near Denver, about the chickens and the vegetable garden and the life he could give her if she was willing to take a chance on a stranger. She had written back that time, just a few lines about her children and her small cabin and her willingness to consider his offer. By winter they were writing every week. She learned that he was 34 years old and had been a soldier once. That he could read and write and fix broken things. that he had been married before but did not speak of his first wife except to say that she was gone. She told him about James and how he had died when a tree fell wrong during logging season. About how the mountain winters were hard and the summers were short and how sometimes she felt like she was disappearing a little more each day. But she had never asked about the sadness she could feel between his written lines. Never asked why a man who wrote about hope sounded like he was carrying something too heavy for one person to bear. Now she was watching him dig, and she understood. Some sorrows were too big for words. Some losses needed to be buried proper before new life could take root. Mary appeared at her elbow, still clutching her doll. "Mama," she whispered, "is he going to hurt us?" Martha looked down at her daughter's upturned face, at the trust there that had not yet learned to doubt every stranger who came calling. She touched Mary's cheek with fingers that trembled just a little. "I don't know, baby girl," she said, "but sometimes we have to take chances on people, even when we don't know their whole story." The digging stopped. The stranger climbed out of the hole and stood beside it, brushing dirt from his hands. He looked toward the cabin again, and this time he raised his hand in greeting. Martha found herself stepping forward, leaving the safety of her doorway. It was time, she supposed, to learn his name. Martha's boots made soft sounds in the snow as she walked across the yard. Each step felt like a choice she could not take back. The stranger stood beside his hole, waiting for her with the patience of a man who had learned that some things could not be rushed. "Samuel," he said when she stopped a few feet away from him. His voice was rough from the cold and from something deeper. "Samuel Hayes." She nodded and pulled her shawl tighter. "Martha Collins." They stood there in the falling snow, two people who had written letters to each other for months, but had never spoken face to face. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Samuel looked toward his wagon, then back at the hole he had dug. "I should have told you in the letters," he said. "About her." Martha followed his gaze to the small wooden box under the canvas. She had known, somehow, what it was, had felt it in her bones the moment she saw how carefully he handled it. How he positioned his body between it and the wind, like he was still trying to protect something that could no longer be hurt. "Your daughter," she said. It was not a question. He nodded once, slow and heavy. "Lucy." She was 4 years old. His words came out like they had been buried deep and he was digging them up one at a time. "Fever took her 3 days outside of Kansas City. I carried her for 200 miles, looking for the right place to lay her down." Martha felt something crack open in her chest. The same feeling she had when the doctor told her that James would not wake up from his injuries. When she realized that all her hoping and praying would not bring him back. She looked at the small grave Samuel had dug and understood why he had chosen her yard. Why he had measured it so carefully with his hands. "Why here?" she asked. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. "Your letters," he said. "You wrote about the pine tree, about how your children played under it in the summer, about how it stayed green even in the hardest winters." He looked up at the old tree that spread its branches over them like arms offering shelter. Seemed like a good place for a little girl to rest. A place where she would not be alone. Martha closed her eyes and felt tears she had been holding back for 2 years finally start to fall. Not just for this man's daughter, but for all the things that had been lost. For James and the baby she had carried for 3 months before her body let it go. For the dreams that died with winter frost and the hopes that never got the chance to grow. When she opened her eyes, Samuel was watching her with something that looked like understanding. Like he could see the shape of her grief and recognize it as the same shape as his own. "We should do this proper," she said. Samuel walked to his wagon and lifted the small coffin with the kind of care she had seen mothers use with sleeping children. It was made of plain pine wood, but she could see where he had carved flowers along the edges with a knife. Small daisies that looked like they might blow away in a strong wind. Martha went to the cabin and returned with her Bible and a handful of winter berries she had been saving for Christmas. Thomas and Mary pressed their faces against the window as she and Samuel carried the coffin to the grave. Their breath fogged the glass, making them look like ghosts watching from another world. The box was so small it seemed wrong to lower it into such a deep hole. Like it might disappear completely and never be found again. But Samuel had wrapped it in a soft blue blanket, and when they placed it in the earth, it looked peaceful. Like Lucy was just sleeping under a winter sky. Martha opened her Bible, but the words seemed too big for what was happening. Too formal for this small ceremony in her yard. Instead, she scattered the red berries on top of the blanket and said the only prayer that felt right. "May you find peace, little one," she whispered. "May the pine tree keep you company, and may the snow cover you gentle." Samuel picked up his shovel and began filling the hole. Martha stood beside him and used her hands to push the cold earth down. Her fingers went numb, but she did not stop. This was the kind of work that needed to be done together. The kind of sorrow that was too heavy for one person to carry alone. When they finished, the grave looked like a small hill covered with snow. Samuel found a flat stone near the creek and placed it at the head. He took out his knife and carved Lucy Hayes into the surface, along with a small daisy to match the ones on her coffin. They stood there as the snow continued to fall, two strangers who were no longer quite strangers. Martha thought about all the things they had not said in their letters. All the losses they had carried in silence because some kinds of pain were too private for words. "Are you hungry?" she asked finally. Samuel looked surprised, like he had forgotten that people still needed to eat and sleep and go on living even after they buried their hearts in frozen ground. "Yes," he said, "I think I am." Martha led him inside, where Thomas and Mary sat by the fire like small sentinels. They watched Samuel with curious eyes as he hung his coat on the peg by the door and washed his hands in the basin. His movements were careful and quiet, like he was trying not to disturb something fragile. She made coffee and heated the last of the rabbit stew from the night before. They ate without talking much, but the silence felt different now. Less careful, less afraid. Mary offered Samuel a piece of her cornbread, and he accepted it with a smile that looked rusty from lack of use. The food tasted like salt and sadness, but it was warm, and it filled the hollow places that grief had carved in all of them. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering Lucy's grave and the wagon and the world beyond the cabin windows. When they finished eating, Samuel pushed back from the table and looked at Martha with eyes that held a question he was not ready to ask. She understood. Tomorrow they would have to decide what came next. Whether he would stay and they would try to build something from the broken pieces of their separate lives. Whether she was ready to take another chance on hope when hope had failed her so many times before. But tonight, there was only the fire and the children's sleepy breathing, and the knowledge that some burdens were lighter when shared with another person who understood the weight of carrying them. Samuel stayed. Martha woke each morning to the sound of his axe splitting wood in the yard, steady as a heartbeat. She would stand at the kitchen window with her coffee, watching him work in the gray dawn light. His movements were sure and practiced, like a man who had spent years learning how to make useful things from broken ones. He slept in the barn, bedded down in the hay with his horse and the wagon that no longer carried its small burden. Martha had offered him the spare room, but he said the barn suited him fine. Said he was not ready yet for walls and closed doors. She understood. Some kinds of healing needed space to breathe. On the third day he noticed the fence around her garden. Half the posts had rotted through the winter, and the whole thing leaned sideways like an old man walking into wind. Martha had been meaning to fix it come spring, but spring felt far away, and the work seemed too big for her hands alone. Samuel walked the fence line that morning, testing each post with gentle pressure. Then he went to his wagon and brought back tools she had not seen him carry. A saw and nails and wire. He worked without asking permission the way a man works on his own land. Martha came out with coffee for him around noon. Steam rose from the cup in the cold air, and she had to walk careful through the snow to keep from spilling it. "You don't have to do that," she said, handing him the cup. Samuel wrapped his fingers around the warm ceramic and looked at the section he had already replaced. "Fence won't hold come spring," he said. "Garden needs protecting." She nodded and watched him drink the coffee. His hands were cut up from the wire, small lines of blood on his knuckles that he had not bothered to tend. She thought about offering to bandage them, then decided against it. Some men needed their wounds to remind them they were still alive. "There's stew for dinner," she said instead. "I'd be grateful for it." That night, Thomas sat beside Samuel at the table and asked about the fence. Samuel explained about post holes and proper depth, about how to stretch wire tight enough to keep rabbits out but not so tight it would snap in the wind. Thomas listened with the serious attention of a boy learning to be a man. Mary was shyer. She watched Samuel from across the room while she played with her doll, but she did not speak to him directly. At least not until the fourth night, when she dropped her spoon during supper and started to cry. Samuel got up from his chair without a word and picked up the spoon. He wiped it clean on his napkin and handed it back to her with a smile that made his whole face look different. "No harm done, little miss," he said. "Spoons are made for dropping sometimes." Mary took the spoon and smiled back. After that, she began to sit closer to him at meals. Martha watched these small moments and felt something she had not expected. Not love exactly. That would take time if it came at all. But something like comfort. Like the feeling of walking into a house where someone had already started a fire. She found herself looking forward to the sound of his footsteps on the porch when he came in for meals. To the way he listened when Thomas told him about the rabbits he had seen in the woods. To the careful way he helped Mary cut her meat without making her feel small. On the seventh night, she noticed the tear in his coat. A long rip along the sleeve where he had caught it on barbed wire while working on the fence. She waited until after the children went to bed, then brought out her sewing basket. "Give me your coat," she said. Samuel looked surprised. "It's just a tear. It'll hold. Give me your coat." He shrugged out of it and handed it over. Martha spread it on the table and threaded her needle by lamplight. The fabric was good wool, but it had seen hard use. She could tell by the way it had been mended before, with stitches that were practical but not pretty. Samuel sat across from her and watched her work. The silence between them felt comfortable now, like an old song they both knew the words to. "My wife used to do that," he said suddenly. Martha looked up from her stitching. It was the first time he had mentioned his first wife since the letters. "She was good at it," he continued. "Better than me at most everything, if I'm being honest." "What was her name?" "Catherine." He said it soft like a prayer. "She died having Lucy. Fever took them both in the end." Martha kept stitching, giving him space for the words that came hard. "I tried to save them," Samuel said. "Rode through a blizzard to fetch the doctor. But by the time we got back..." He stopped and looked at his hands. "Some things can't be fixed, no matter how hard you work at them." Martha finished the sleeve and held up the coat to check her work. The stitches were small and even, almost invisible in the lamplight. "Some things can be," she said, handing it back to him. The next morning, Thomas woke up burning with fever. Martha found him shaking in his bed. His small face flushed red and his breathing quick and shallow. She put her hand to his forehead and felt the heat that every mother knows to fear. The heat that takes children away in the night and leaves nothing but empty beds and broken hearts. She called for Samuel without thinking. He appeared in the doorway still pulling on his shirt, his hair messy from sleep. "It's the fever," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. Samuel went very still. She saw something pass across his face like a shadow, and she knew he was remembering his Lucy. Remembering another child and another fever and the helplessness of watching someone you love slip away. For a moment she thought he might turn around and walk out. Might get in his wagon and drive away from this cabin and these children and the terrible possibility of losing again. She would not have blamed him. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and moved to the other side of Thomas's bed. "What do we need?" he asked. They spent the day fighting the fever with cool cloths and willow bark tea. Martha held Thomas while Samuel rode to the creek to break ice for water. They took turns sitting beside the bed, one sleeping while the other watched for changes in his breathing. Mary curled up in the corner with her doll, understanding without being told that something serious was happening. that the adults were scared in a way that made the whole cabin feel smaller. As night fell, Thomas grew worse. His fever climbed higher and he began to speak words that made no sense, calling for his father and reaching for things that were not there. Martha held his hot little hand and tried not to think about the small grave under the pine tree. Tried not to imagine digging another hole in the frozen ground. Samuel brought her coffee and sat down in the chair beside her. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the windows. Inside, the fire burned low and cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Tell me about him," Samuel said quietly. "When he was well." So Martha told him about how Thomas could track animals through the woods like he was born to it. About his laugh and the way he helped her with chores without being asked. About how he still sometimes crawled into her bed during thunderstorms, even though he thought he was too old for such things. Samuel listened and nodded and shared his own stories about Lucy. About her love of flowers and her habit of talking to birds like they could understand her. About the songs she made up and the way she danced when she thought no one was looking. They talked through the night, taking turns holding Thomas's hand and wiping his forehead with cool cloths. Taking turns keeping the fear from swallowing them whole. And somewhere in those dark hours, Martha realized that Samuel was not just helping her tend a sick child. He was choosing to stay and fight, even when staying meant risking his heart again. Near dawn, Thomas's fever finally broke. His breathing grew deeper and his skin began to cool. Martha felt tears she had been holding back all night start to fall, but this time they were tears of relief. Samuel touched her shoulder gently. "He's going to be all right," he said. Martha looked at this man who had chosen to sit vigil with her, who had faced his worst fear and stayed anyway, who had helped her carry a burden that might have broken her if she had carried it alone. Maybe, she thought, some seeds could grow even in winter ground, if they were tended with enough care. The snow began to melt in March, running off the cabin roof in streams that sounded like whispered conversations. Thomas grew stronger each day. His fever nothing but a memory that had left him thin but alive. He followed Samuel around the yard like a shadow, asking questions about everything from horseshoes to cloud formations. Martha watched from the kitchen window as Samuel taught her son to whittle. Their heads bent together over a piece of pine wood, Samuel's large hands guiding Thomas's small ones. The knife moved slow and careful, carving away thin curls that fell to the ground like yellow snow. "What are you making?" she heard Thomas ask. "A bird," Samuel said. "Your sister might like it." Martha smiled and turned back to her bread dough. Mary would indeed like it. She had been collecting Samuel's wood shavings for weeks, keeping them in a small box under her bed like they were precious things. Everything Samuel touched seemed to become important to her daughter. The first wildflowers appeared in April, pushing up through the soft earth around Lucy's grave. Tiny purple blooms that looked too delicate to survive the mountain winds. Martha found Samuel kneeling beside them one morning, his fingers hovering over the petals like he was afraid to touch something so fragile. "She would have loved these," he said without looking up. Martha knelt beside him in the damp earth. The flowers were smaller than her thumbnail, but they caught the morning light and held it. "She still does," Martha said. "Some part of her still does." Samuel looked at her then, and she saw something shift in his face. Some wall that had been standing there since the day he arrived finally beginning to crack. That afternoon he brought a small canvas bag from his wagon. Inside were seeds he had been carrying since Kansas City. Vegetable seeds and flower seeds and herbs that Catherine had loved in their garden back home. "I thought maybe," he said, holding the bag like it contained something alive, "if you wanted, we could plant them." Martha took the bag and felt the weight of all the springs Samuel had not planted. All the gardens he had not tended because tending meant hoping, and hoping meant risking loss again. "The children should help," she said. They spent the next week preparing the ground. Samuel expanded Martha's garden, breaking new earth with the same care he had used to dig Lucy's grave. Thomas and Mary helped carry rocks and spread the dark soil Samuel brought up from the creek bottom. Mary was the one who suggested planting some of the flowers near Lucy's resting place. "So she won't be lonely," the little girl said, her voice serious as a preacher's. Samuel stopped his digging and looked at Mary for a long moment. Then he nodded and handed her a packet of morning glory seeds. "These were her favorites," he said. "They climbed toward the sun. They planted in rows as neat as soldiers. Beans and squash and corn for eating. Flowers and herbs for beauty and healing." Martha showed the children how to make holes with their fingers, how to drop the seeds gentle and cover them with just enough earth to keep them safe. Samuel worked beside them, his movements sure and practiced. But Martha noticed how he lingered over each seed, like he was planting prayers instead of vegetables, like he was finally allowing himself to believe in harvest time. As they worked, Thomas chattered about the things he had learned from Samuel. How to tell good wood from bad. How to read the sky for weather. How to be still enough that wild animals would come close without fear. "Samuel says I have gentle hands," Thomas told his mother proudly. "Like his Lucy did." Martha looked up to find Samuel watching her son with something that looked like wonder. Like he had not expected to find joy in teaching again. Had not known that love could stretch to cover more than one child's memory. The wedding happened without planning, the way the best things sometimes do. It was a Sunday in May, and Martha was hanging laundry on the line Samuel had strung between the cabin and the old pine tree. The morning glories he and Mary had planted were beginning to climb, reaching their green fingers toward the light. Samuel came around the corner of the cabin carrying wildflowers he had picked from the meadow. Simple mountain blooms in white and yellow and purple. He stopped when he saw her there with the wet sheets flapping in the breeze like flags of surrender. "Martha," he said, and something in his voice made her turn around. He stood there holding the flowers, and she could see him gathering courage like a man about to jump across a wide creek. "I know this isn't what we planned in the letters," he said. "I know I came here carrying more sorrow than you bargained for." Martha set down her laundry basket and walked toward him, her feet bare in the new grass. "But these months," Samuel continued, "watching Thomas get well, seeing Mary smile, sharing meals at your table, I think maybe we could make something good together. Something that honors what we've lost without being afraid of what we might find." He held out the flowers. "Would you marry me, Martha Collins? Not because we're lonely or because it makes practical sense, but because I think I'm falling in love with the woman who mended my coat and sat up all night fighting for my boy's life like he was her own." Martha took the flowers and breathed in their sweet smell. Behind Samuel, she could see Thomas and Mary peeking around the corner of the cabin, their eyes wide with excitement. "Yes," she said, "but I want the children to stand with us." They married under the pine tree with no preacher except the wind and no witnesses except the mountains and the small grave that had brought them together. Martha wore her Sunday dress and the wildflowers Samuel had picked. Samuel wore his mended coat and a smile that made him look years younger. Thomas held Martha's hand while Mary held Samuel's. The four of them stood in a circle under the green branches while Samuel spoke the words he had been practicing in his heart. "I promise to tend your sorrows like I tend the garden," he said, "to help them grow into something beautiful instead of letting them wither in the dark." Martha spoke her own vows in return. "I promise to share your burdens and your joys, to help you remember that love is not something to be feared, even when it comes with the risk of loss." They exchanged rings made from bent nails Samuel had hammered smooth. Simple bands that would wear with work and time and the business of living. Then they kissed while the children cheered and the morning glories reached higher toward the sky. That night, after Thomas and Mary had been tucked into their beds with stories about the wedding feast they would have when they went to town next, Martha and Samuel sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. The garden they had planted together was beginning to show green shoots. Tiny promises pushing up through the dark earth, reaching toward light they could not yet see but somehow knew was there. Samuel took her hand, calloused palm against calloused palm. "I never thought I'd be this grateful for grief," he said quietly, "for the way it led me here, to you, to this." Martha leaned against his shoulder and felt the steady rhythm of his breathing. Around them the night was full of small sounds, growing sounds, the whisper of new leaves and the soft settling of earth around expanding roots. Sometimes, she said, the deepest love grows from the darkest soil. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had learned that endings could become beginnings, that loss could teach you how to hold on to what you found. Above them, the pine tree spread its ancient branches, sheltering both the living and the dead, while beneath the earth, seeds they had planted together began the slow work of becoming. So that's the story for today. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. On a scale of 10 to 0, how would you rate this story? And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay happy and take care.